Imagine facing an enemy warrior swinging a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp volcanic glass that could decapitate a horse with a single blow. Now imagine that's just one weapon in an entire arsenal designed to be as terrifying as it was effective. The Aztec military didn't mess around when it came to warfare. While European knights were clanking around in metal armor with swords that could barely cut through a thick jacket, Aztec warriors were wielding weapons that could slice through flesh and bone like a hot knife through butter. But here's what most people don't realize about Aztec weapons. Their brutality came not from advanced metalworking, which they didn't have, but from their masterful use of obsidian, a volcanic glass that could be flaked into blades far sharper than steel. These weren't just crude clubs and spears thrown together by primitive warriors. The Aztecs developed a sophisticated arsenal of weapons that were specifically engineered to exploit weaknesses in enemy defenses and maximize psychological terror on the battlefield. The Spanish conquistadors who faced these weapons firsthand wrote detailed accounts of their devastating effectiveness. Hernán Cortés himself described watching Aztec warriors decapitate horses with their obsidian-edged clubs, something that would have been impossible with European weapons of the time. What made these weapons truly brutal wasn't just their ability to kill, but how they killed. The Aztecs understood that warfare was as much about breaking enemy morale as it was about inflicting casualties. Their weapons were designed to create wounds that were not only fatal, but visually horrifying, turning every battlefield into a scene that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The weapon manufacturing process itself was a closely guarded art form passed down through generations of master craftsmen. These specialists, known as Tolteca, were revered in Aztec society and held positions of honor comparable to priests or nobles. They understood the molecular structure of obsidian better than most modern materials scientists, knowing exactly how to strike volcanic glass to create blades that were only a few molecules thick at the cutting edge. The quality control standards for Aztec weapons were extraordinarily high. Each obsidian blade was individually tested for sharpness and durability before being incorporated into a weapon. Inferior blades were rejected and recycled, while only the finest pieces made it into the weapons that would see actual combat. This attention to detail meant that Aztec weapons maintained consistent performance standards that European weapons of the era couldn't match. The macuahuitl was the most famous and feared weapon in the Aztec arsenal. Picture a wooden club, roughly the size of a European broadsword, but instead of a metal blade, it had razor-sharp obsidian blades set into grooves along both sides. This wasn't just a bigger, meaner version of a regular club. It was a precision weapon that combined the crushing power of a mace with the cutting ability of a sword. The construction of a macuahuitl required incredible skill and patience. Master craftsmen would select specific types of hardwood, usually oak, and carefully carve grooves along the edges. Into these grooves, they would set pieces of obsidian that had been knapped to create edges sharper than modern surgical scalpels. The obsidian pieces were secured with plant-based adhesives and wrapped with leather or fiber cords. The weight distribution of a macuahuitl was carefully calculated to maximize striking power while maintaining control. A typical weapon weighed between 5 and 8 pounds, with most of the weight concentrated in the striking head. This design allowed warriors to generate tremendous momentum while still being able to recover quickly for follow-up strikes or defensive maneuvers. Spanish chroniclers describe the devastating effectiveness of these weapons with a mixture of admiration and horror. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who fought alongside Cortés, wrote that he witnessed an Aztec warrior decapitate a horse with a single swing of a macuahuitl. The obsidian blades were so sharp that they could slice through the horse's neck in one clean cut, something that would have been impossible with a steel sword of that era. The psychological impact of the macuahuitl was as important as its physical effectiveness. The weapon created massive gaping wounds that bled profusely and were almost impossible to treat with medieval medical techniques. Warriors struck by a macuahuitl didn't just die. They died in ways that terrified everyone who witnessed it. The distinctive sound of obsidian blades cutting through flesh and bone became a nightmare soundtrack that haunted Spanish soldiers long after battles ended. Training with the macuahuitl began in childhood for young Aztec nobles destined for military careers. Students learned not just how to swing the weapon effectively, but how to maintain and repair it in the field. They practiced on specially designed targets that simulated different types of armor and learned to adjust their striking techniques based on what their opponents were wearing. The tepos tapili was essentially a spear or halberd with a broad, flat head edged with obsidian blades, similar to the macuahuitl, but mounted on a long wooden shaft. This gave Aztec warriors the ability to deliver those devastating obsidian cuts from a much safer distance, allowing them to slash and thrust at enemies who couldn't get close enough to retaliate effectively. The tactical advantages of the tepos tapili were enormous. The long shaft, typically 5 to 7 feet in length, allowed warriors to engage enemies from beyond the reach of most hand weapons. The broad, obsidian-edged head could deliver slashing attacks that were just as devastating as those from a macuahuitl, but with the added leverage and reach that made them even more powerful. Spanish cavalry found the tepos tapili particularly troublesome because it gave Aztec foot soldiers the ability to attack mounted opponents effectively while staying out of range of cavalry swords and lances. The obsidian edges could slice through leather horse armor and inflict wounds that would bring down even the largest war horses. Many Spanish accounts describe the horror of watching their cavalry charges broken up by lines of Aztec warriors wielding these long-reaching death dealers. The versatility of the tepos tapili made it a favorite weapon among Aztec warriors who couldn't afford the more expensive macuahuitl. The same weapon could be used for thrusting attacks like a spear, slashing attacks like a sword, or even hooking and pulling maneuvers to drag enemies off balance. This multi-purpose capability made it an excellent choice for warriors who needed to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The atlatl was a simple but devastatingly effective weapon that multiplied the power and range of thrown spears. This spear thrower consisted of a wooden shaft with a hook or socket at one end that held a dart or javelin. When thrown using the atlatl, the projectile could achieve speeds and distances that were impossible with hand-thrown spears alone. The physics behind the atlatl were elegantly simple but incredibly effective. The device essentially extended the length of the thrower's arm, creating additional leverage that dramatically increased the velocity of the projectile. Modern tests with replica atlatls have shown that they can propel darts at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour and achieve accurate ranges of over 150 yards. Aztec warriors using atlatls could engage enemies from distances where return fire was impossible with most contemporary weapons. A skilled atlatl user could launch a dart with enough force to penetrate Spanish armor at ranges where the Spanish couldn't effectively respond with their crossbows or early firearms. This gave Aztec forces a significant tactical advantage in the opening phases of many battles. The training regimen for atlatl specialists was rigorous and began in early childhood. Young warriors would practice for hours daily, learning to judge distances, compensate for wind, and maintain accuracy under the stress of combat. Master atlatl users could achieve rates of fire approaching one dart every 3 seconds, while maintaining lethal accuracy at ranges exceeding 100 yards. The tlacochtli were the short spears or darts used with the atlatl. These weren't just sharpened sticks. They were precision weapons with obsidian or flint points that could punch through armor and create devastating wounds. The darts were typically 4 to 6 feet long and carefully balanced for optimal flight characteristics. The aerodynamic design of tlacochtli was sophisticated, with carefully shaped points and fletching that stabilized flight and maximized penetration. Different types of points were used for different targets. Broad, razor-sharp obsidian heads for unarmored opponents, and narrow armor-piercing points for heavily protected enemies. The tematl, or sling, was one of the most underestimated weapons in the Aztec arsenal. While it might look like nothing more than a simple leather pouch attached to cords, in the hands of a skilled warrior, it became a precision instrument of death that could kill at surprising distances. Aztec slingers were renowned throughout Mesoamerica for their accuracy and power. They could hurl stones with enough force to crack skulls, break bones, and knock enemies unconscious from distances of over 200 yards. The stones used weren't just random rocks. They were carefully selected and shaped projectiles designed for maximum aerodynamic efficiency and impact. The ammunition variety for slings was impressive and tactical. Standard stones were shaped into perfect spheres for maximum range and accuracy. Clay bullets were fired and hardened to create projectiles harder than natural stone. Lead pellets, when available, provided maximum density and impact force. Some specialized ammunition included hollow clay spheres filled with smaller stones that would scatter on impact, creating a primitive but effective shrapnel effect. Spanish accounts describe the devastating effectiveness of Aztec slingers with a mixture of respect and fear. The stones could dent Spanish helmets, break arms and legs, and knock mounted warriors from their horses. Unlike arrows, which could be deflected by armor or shields, sling stones delivered blunt force trauma that could incapacitate enemies even when they didn't penetrate protective gear. The tlatzontechtli was a war club designed for pure crushing power. Unlike the macuahuitl with its cutting edges, this weapon was all about delivering devastating blunt force trauma that could shatter bones and crush skulls even through protective armor. The construction of the tlatzontechtli emphasized weight and durability over cutting ability. The club featured a thick wooden shaft, ending in a heavy, solid head that might be made of stone, hardwood, or even metal when available. Some versions incorporated spikes or knobs that concentrated the impact force into smaller areas, increasing the weapon's ability to penetrate armor or create devastating wounds. Blunt force weapons like the tlatzontechtli were particularly effective against enemies wearing thick padding or leather armor that might turn aside cutting weapons. The crushing impact could break bones and cause internal injuries even when the weapon didn't penetrate the target's protective gear. This made it an excellent choice for fighting heavily armored opponents who might be resistant to obsidian-edged weapons. The quauholali featured a wooden or stone ball at the end of a handle, creating a weapon that was essentially a medieval morning star without the metal spikes. The ball concentrated the weapon's weight at the striking end, creating tremendous impact force that could crush bones and shatter shields with devastating effectiveness. Combat techniques with the quauholali emphasized circular swinging motions that built up momentum before impact. Skilled warriors could generate tremendous force by using their entire body to power the swing, creating impacts that could knock enemies off their feet or break through defensive formations. The weapon was particularly effective against shield walls, where its crushing power could break shields and the arms holding them. The huitzalqui was essentially a heavy baseball bat-like club that was often studded with obsidian blades or sharp stones. This weapon combined the crushing power of a blunt weapon with the cutting ability of an edged weapon, creating a versatile tool that could adapt to different combat situations. The dual-purpose design of the huitzalqui made it particularly effective against a variety of enemy types. Against lightly armored opponents, the obsidian blades could inflict devastating cuts and slashes. Against heavily armored enemies, the club portion could deliver crushing blows that would incapacitate even when they didn't penetrate protective gear. The tlahuitoli, or Aztec bow, represented the more traditional side of their military technology. While not as innovative as some of their other weapons, it remained an important part of their arsenal because of its reliability, range, and ease of use. Aztec bows were typically made from flexible woods and designed for power rather than rapid fire. The arrows used with these bows were often tipped with obsidian, flint, or bone points that could penetrate light armor and inflict serious wounds. The tactical role of archers in Aztec warfare was primarily to provide covering fire and harass enemy formations before the main assault. The chuhuitzoli wasn't technically a weapon itself, but rather the feathered headdress worn by elite warriors who had proven their deadly skill in battle. This ornate headpiece served as both a status symbol and a psychological weapon, identifying the wearer as someone who had earned the right to fight in the most brutal encounters. Warriors who wore the chuhuitzoli had demonstrated their mastery of multiple weapons and their ability to survive the chaos of Aztec warfare. The sight of these elite warriors on the battlefield, with their elaborate feathered headdresses and proven combat skills, could demoralize enemies before the fighting even began. The legacy of Aztec weapons extends far beyond their immediate military effectiveness. These weapons represented a sophisticated understanding of materials, science, physics, and psychology that allowed a civilization without metal tools to create some of the most effective military technology of their era. The obsidian technology that made many of these weapons possible was so advanced that modern surgeons still use obsidian scalpels for certain procedures because they can be made sharper than steel. The Aztecs had mastered this technology centuries before. Europeans even knew obsidian existed. The tactical integration of these weapons into coordinated military systems showed a level of strategic thinking that impressed even their Spanish conquerors. Each weapon served a specific purpose in battle, and Aztec warriors were trained to use multiple weapons effectively depending on the situation. Perhaps most importantly, these weapons remind us that technological sophistication doesn't always require advanced materials or complex manufacturing processes. The Aztecs created devastatingly effective weapons using materials and techniques that were available to them, proving that innovation and ingenuity can overcome apparent technological limitations. The brutal effectiveness of Aztec weapons ultimately couldn't save their civilization for the combined effects of European diseases, superior numbers, and political alliances that turned their enemies against them. But their weapons remain a testament to human creativity in the art of warfare, and a reminder that the most fearsome weapons aren't always the most technologically advanced ones. These 10 weapons represent just a fraction of the Aztec military arsenal, but they demonstrate the sophisticated thinking and skilled craftsmanship that went into creating tools of war that were both brutally effective and psychologically terrifying. In an age when warfare was personal, and victory often depended on breaking enemy morale as much as inflicting casualties, the Aztecs had mastered both aspects of combat with weapons that remain impressive even by modern standards.